You mentioned in your introduction that the BBC reported that the internet could be fueling a crisis in the relationship between politics and voters.
Yeah.
And particularly, you mentioned blogs and bloggers within this relationship. Could you expand on that further?
Well, I think that what the speaker was intending to say, and what he probably did say, I've obviously only seen the BBC report of the conference, was that it's an uncontrollable medium. And what he was particularly offended by was the fact that bloggers tend to slag off politicians without, as far as he was concerned, and don't forget this is a person who's been the Prime Minister's policy advisor for a long time, for 3 years I think, that without paying any attention to the difficulties and the intricacies of government. So in other words, a typical blogger doesn't pay attention to what the pros and cons of a policy are. They just say, we want that and we want it now. If a member of the government, if an MP, if a representative doesn't reply on those particular lines, then they get flamed.
But do you feel that this is a bad thing, or would this be, useful in terms of actually not evading sort of media censorship, quote unquote?
I think it represents two things, and one of which I try and pick up in the paper that I've written. The first is that it represents a long tradition now of governments wanting to manage the media. And so if they can't manage the media and therefore manage the message, they don't very much like it. And so I think they don't like the messiness of the blogosphere. They don't like the messiness of bloggers firing on about politicians not doing this and not doing that. So that's the first side to it. And I think the second side is they don't like the uncontrollability of it. They feel unsure, uncertain, and they don't really know how to react to it. So there's two things going on together. I think that's a bad thing in relation to democracy, because I actually think that we need to give people. We've had a situation now in developed countries, in the Western world generally, and in the Soviet Union and so on, where the message has always been managed, and freedom of speech has really been reduced to a minimum. And we need, I think, to go back to a situation where there's a more open and honest debate. And if bloggers can achieve that, then I think it's a good thing.
At the same time, though, you have politicians using blogs to say, well, to send out their own message.
Absolutely.
And, well, that's again, they're sort of censoring, or they're sort of narrowing the message they want to send out to the audience on the web. What impact would this have on the blogosphere as a whole?
Well, I think that is a very interesting point you raise, because I know a number of blog sites and a number of websites have spotted politicians or people who have been paid by political parties or paid by the government to come on and interject in the conversation, try to steer that blog or that conversation in a particular way. In other words, manage the agenda. It goes back to the same thing, really, that I said earlier. It's about media management. It's about managing the agenda. And it's therefore about managing the policy outcomes and the expectations of the general public in relation to that policy.
And how would in terms of managing policy outcomes, how would one control the rest of the blogosphere? Because on the one hand you've got managed messages, on the other hand you've got, well, unmanaged messages.
Yes, that's an interesting one. Obviously there are technological, obviously if things, as we were talking about at the conference today, if things get really messy and really out of control, there are technological fixes that can be implemented to control blog sites, to control what bloggers say. For example, the current speaker's talking about legislation to stop hate speech and that kind of stuff. So we've got that in Europe particularly. But I think beyond that, I think that so long as established power interests in society believe that the blogosphere is largely being read by other bloggers who may follow or have similar interests, and it doesn't really reflect much more widely out in society, then I think they'll probably see it as generally controlled and controllable. It's if the blogosphere, it's if bloggers as a whole grow to an extent where they're beginning to influence mainstream media, the mainstream message that goes out to citizens, to voters. And at the moment, I don't think that's happening at all.
A previous interview mentioned that citizen blogging is part of a broader term, citizen journalism, and it's becoming co-opted by, say, mainstream media organisations.
Absolutely,
as a means of sort of, well, making their messages or the news more accessible and more popular with the general public.
Yeah.
So if the establishment, quote unquote, sees the blogosphere as reaching a wider audience, surely it should be worried about that.
Yeah, well, it should. Yes, I agree with you entirely, and I think at the point at which established interests see that happening, then they will become much more interested than they probably are now. And I think this is why you do see established media interests like The Guardian, The Times, even the Daily Telegraph now, launching websites, getting their own blogs in first, really following the lead that quite a lot of journalists have followed, independently of the paper or the organisation they work for some while. But still at the moment, I mean in my paper I refer to it as small democracy. It's at the moment it's still in the realms of small democracy. It still isn't a direct threat or having a direct impact on policy outcomes. It may well be forcing the powers that be in society to sit up and take much more interest of what goes on the input side of policy, the blog side and the internet generally. But I don't think you see any evidence of it having any impact on the output side, on policy decisions, for example, on Trident and this, that and the other.
At what point do you see small democracy connect with big democracy in terms of policy making and decision making?
As somebody who's been involved in research on the internet since the early 90s, in the days when there was a lot of hype and hope about the way in which the internet would reinvigorate and reinvent democracy, I would like to say to you that I see a point at which small democracy will almost come to certainly steer big democracy, if not maybe supersede it. But I'm afraid I actually don't see that. I see technological developments, and I see established power interests who always come late to these kind of shows. You know, the internet was a disruptive technology, power interests have come late to it, but they always come late to these kind of shows. They reassert their power eventually, and that's what will happen now.
And what impact do you think management consultancies sort of managing the power interests presence on the internet would have on it?
Well, yeah, that's a particular focus of my paper because my core argument is that the internet cannot be seen as separate to terrestrial society and terrestrial power relations. And so therefore, the form of governance that we see at a terrestrial level, which I argue is a managed democracy, reflects and is reflected in the internet and the governance of the internet. And within managed democracies now, right across the Western world, the OECD countries, we see consultants, technology experts and technology managers, as I refer to them, taking control, if you like, of policy making, of the policy agenda. One vehicle that I argue is being used for that is the whole e-government agenda. And they then have a direct interest in the commercial the profitability, if you like, or the commercial gain that can be got from those kind of developments. And the same would apply in cyberspace, or does apply in cyberspace. I think if you look at the regulatory bodies that now operate across the internet, even though these have been drawn from a range of sources, the representatives on those are often sent because of their expertise, and they're representing commercial interests. If they're not, it's only in the areas where commercial interests don't control or seek to control the internet that government then interjects its own experts. So,
and what impact do you see this having on the internet's potential to improve, say, elected officials' accountability and transparency?
Again, I would go back to thinking from the 90s and even in the 80s in the States, and that would be that I would hope it would make them sit up and start to pay attention to the broad range of issues and concerns of the general public, not the ones that get filtered through the different mechanisms and end up on their table, but that we actually live in a very complex society. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, I don't think that will happen. I think that kind of democracy is too messy, it's too costly in terms of the amount of effort and money it costs to manage that, and the outcomes are too uncertain. And I think politicians aren't in the business really of dealing with uncertain outcomes. They want certainties.
Would you say this is, I mean, this is sort of, this can be seen in the fact that the UN envoy to Sudan got kicked off his mission because of his blog?
Yes, absolutely. That's right. He was off message. He moved outside the management of that message. So in a managed democracy, you would expect people who move outside the management field, the field of managed democracy or the field of management, to be dismissed, as you would indeed in a commercial company.
So this is the question of the public and the private sort of becoming one.
The public and the private becoming one, absolutely. That is the core. That is one of the core pushes, I think. As consumerism has more and more taken over democracy in some of the forms that we would perhaps have wanted it to occur in past generations, and perhaps a more participatory democracy, a more direct democracy. But as in reality, as consumerism has become more and more to dominate, then we've seen the need for more and more management of democracy to fit within that model.
And this is depressing.
To me, it's deeply depressing.
Thank you very much.
Okay.